About 10,000 years ago, the situation on Tyria was devastating. Before the dragons returned to their slumber, they left the lands destroyed and devoid of magic. Though it was also hopeful, the elder races, who survived the war thanks to Glint's protection, began to rebuild their civilizations. The dwarves settled all over the Shiver Peaks, presumably founding their dwarven nation of Deldrimor and uniting under King Drognar's banner in this time. The Jotun returned to their nomadic ways, forming tribes and spreading over the lands. Over time, they fell victim to wars among themselves, which killed most of their lore keepers and shamans. And with them, most of their magical prowess died, so they slowly dwindled from their powerful standing in the world, until only runestones and stele remain as a reminder of what once was. The Mursat made good on their promise to return and enact their revenge, and waged a brutal war against the Seers that spanned over multiple centuries, leaving both races devastated. Even though the Seers found a way to protect themselves against the Mursat's powerful spectral agony magic, they were significantly weakened by their struggle with the Elder Dragons and the sealing of a majority of their power into the Bloodstone. They were ultimately defeated. The remaining Mursat hid themselves on Tyria after this, waiting for the right time to emerge again. The Forgotten banded together with Glint and took up the task to aid the less developed races of Tyria in rebuilding and spread over most of the Tyrian land. Far to the northeast, the Char began rebuilding their society as well. First, only as small warbands who often warred with each other. At some point, one powerful warlord, only known as Khan-Ur, rose to power and managed to unify the warbands into one tribe. With this newfound strength, they started to expand down from the Blaze Ridge Mountains, first taking Grothmar and later the region that is known as Ascalon today, defeating everything that stood in their way and replacing dwarves and Grawl as dominant force in these lands. With this, a new normality took its shape, as it had so often before after a Dragonrise. But normality often isn't as stable as it appears. In Or, the resting place of the Elder Dragon Zaitan, the magic seeped back into the lands, and its power was so concentrated in one place that the shockwaves of it was felt throughout the mists. And someone, took notice. Around 1500 before the Exodus, Dwayna, the goddess of air, healing, and life, stepped onto Tyrian soil for the first time at the Artesian waters. Following her was Balthazar, god of fire, war, and challenge, flanked by his hounds Timor and Tegan, and carrying the severed head of his father. Then, the eldest of the gods arrived, Melandru, goddess of earth, nature, and growth. Accompanying her were the twin goddess Lyssa, goddesses of beauty and illusions. Abaddon, god of water, knowledge, and secrets. And Dhuum, god of ice, shadows, and death. Balthazar unleashed his flames on Or, cleansing it and urging Dwayna to take Tyria by force. Melandru, on the other hand, argued to contain Balthazar's violent impulses, placing her hands down on Or and transforming the land into a lush green paradise. They made Or their home and constructed a city for them to live in, Ara, the Golden City. Upon completing their residence, the gods took their time to explore Tyria, and in the process, amassing a lot of magical artifacts, including a telescope the Jotun used to read the stars, and the Bloodstone, bringing them back to Or. As soon as their work was done to their satisfaction, they led the first humans into Tyria through the mists. Although, for unknown reasons, they didn't choose the Tyrian mainland for the first human settlements, instead choosing the far Canthian northern coastline as their domain. The first recorded instance of humanity in Cantha being around 700 before the Exodus. There, humanity began to flourish, with some tribes branching off into the Canthian mainland and the Canthian seas. These tribes evolving into the modern tribes of the forest-dwelling Kurzik and the nomadic Luxan. Over time, the coastline tribes fell into wars with each other, until a brutal warlord, known as Kain, managed to conquer all of them, eventually crowning himself Emperor Kaineng Ta, and establishing the first human empire around 500 before the Exodus. In another part of the world, sometime before 200 before the Exodus, the first humans arrived in Elona. Not much is known about early Elonian history, only that the Primeval Dynasty was established around 200 before the Exodus, and was ended by the brutal Scarab Plague in the year 525 after the Exodus. Around the same time, the first human settlements were established around Or as well. From there, human expansionism knew no bounds, establishing themselves in Kryta around 150 before the Exodus, and waging war against the Char in Ascalon. This war would plague humanity for more than 1,000 years. About 25 years after humanity began the conquest against the Char, a human named Doric traveled to Or to bid the gods for their aid. His pleas were heard, Dwayna being touched by Doric's words in particular, ordered Balthazar to help humanity in their struggle. The Char, being fractured into 4 different high legions after the death of the Khan Ur, stood no chance against the humans and the might of their god of war. They were driven out of Ascalon, but never let go of their claim to the land, conflicts between humanity and Char flaring up every so often. "15 years later, as the war concluded, Doric was gifted 3 magical artifacts by the gods to safeguard the human realms against invaders. 2 magical swords, Magdair and its twin, Balthazar's own sword, Sohothin, and a magical crown said to contain the power to unleash a powerful spell to protect humanity. With this crown, Doric was declared the first king of the united human realms of Or, Kryta, and Ascalon. At some point, the gods encountered Glint and the Forgotten, and judged them to be valuable allies. Faced with the immense power of the gods and the promise that the newly blossoming humanity showed, the Forgotten devoted themselves to the gods and helping humanity, even briefly warring with the Char. After the establishment of the united human realms, aside from a few skirmishes with the Char, Centaurs, or the in Kryta living Tengu, times became more or less peaceful. Under the guidance of the gods and the Forgotten, humanity was allowed to thrive and build impressive cities, ranging from Lion's Arch in Kryta to Rin and Draskir in Ascalon. In Or, the gods lived among their followers, who erected huge cathedrals dedicated to their deities. Though around 80 before the Exodus, the gods noticed that mortals who gazed upon them for too long lost their sight. Concerned, Dwayna decided the gods should seclude themselves in Aran, as not to harm their citizens any further. Thinking that humanity still needed something tangible to worship, Dwayna commissioned the best sculptor in Or, Malchor, to construct statues of the six. Knowing he would be rendered blind as well, but proud to serve his gods, Malchor accepted and started working on the sculptures. After each carving was completed, the portrayed god would recede into Aran, never to be seen again by most mortals. The last statue to be constructed was Dwayna's. The already blinding Malchor laid eyes on Dwayna and fell madly in love with her, becoming obsessed with capturing her beauty. While sculpting, his eyesight vanished completely. Yet, he completed his task perfectly, since he committed every detail of Dwayna's likeness into memory since the first time witnessing her. After finalizing his work, he asked the goddess if he had captured her essence to her favor. Seeing the suffering which Malchor endured and the sacrifices he made to complete his commission, the goddess wept and allowed him to touch her face, so the blind sculptor could feel with which precision he had carved the statue in her image. Then, knowing she needed to retreat into Ara as well, she left Malchor alone in the dark. Consumed by the thought that he would never see the face of his beloved goddess again, the sculptor slowly lost his mind. Standing on the cliff near Dwayna's cathedral, where his statue was displayed, blind and hopeless, he jumped. This cliff would become known as Malchors Leap and be commemorated by Oriens for centuries. A while later in Ara, the half-god Grenth was born to Dwayna, his father being described as an unknown sculptor in scriptures fiercely guarded by the Church of Grenth. He was allowed to grow up in Ara, but also ventured out into Or in his youth. During his travels, he grew interested in death and necromancy. Though he soon had to discover that the god of death, Dhuum, inhibited souls from any kind of reincarnation, be it in form of true rebirth or in form of necromancy or undeath. Unsettled by this, Grenth chose to investigate and began to unravel the true meaning behind Dhuum's moniker of the Final Death. The god of shadows, who, unlike the other gods, didn't spend most of his time in Ara and rather dwelled in the underworld, would not grant souls a peaceful afterlife or let them reincarnate, but consumed their essence to grow stronger. Appalled by this revelation, Grenth swore that he would put an end to Dhuum's reign. He knew he couldn't fight the god alone, and thus started gathering a following of like-minded individuals. The first of which would be Desmina, who was exiled by her people in Or because of her ambition and admiration of power. Angered by her exiling, she vowed to devote her life to anyone who could give her the power to take revenge on those who had wronged her. She met Grenth, who answered this vow, and became his first follower. More should soon follow. Around 48 before the Exodus, when Dhuum was in Ara, Grenth gathered Desmina and his 7 most loyal followers and went to challenge the god of death. It was a hard-fought battle, but ultimately Grenth and his reapers prevailed and defeated Dhuum near Malchors Leap. Dhuum's powers were transferred to Grenth, who was crowned the new god of death and took his place in the pantheon next to his mother. He was not able to destroy Dhuum though, so he imprisoned the fallen god in the underworld. There, Grenth toppled Dhuum's tower, creating the Chaos Plains out of the rubble, and putting an end to Dhuum's tyranny of the dead. In Or, Grenth's followers tore down the cathedral of the disgraced god, and erected the Cathedral of Silence, which would become the central place of worship for the new god of death. The 7 Reapers were rewarded by Grenth and were made his avatars, tasked with governing parts of the underworld in his absence and communing with mortals seeking his aid. After Dhuum's defeat, life in Or and Ara calmed down again. The gods continued to gather magical instruments and trinkets, and it became dangerous to further keep them in Ara itself. So the god of secrets, Abaddon, took the task upon himself to construct reliquaries in Or, one for each god, where they could safeguard their most prized possessions from intruders and themselves. his own reliquary being the center stone of this construction. He also founded the Sirens of Ore, an order that could invoke the powers of the god through the use of divine dirges dedicated to each of the gods, and tasked them with keeping the reliquary safe. Among their collection of magical items, there was one object that fascinated the gods more than any other: the Bloodstone. They devoted a great amount of time to studying it, and soon realized what kind of power it held. The Six decided to set the magic free and gift it to the mortal races. This endeavor was entrusted to Abaddon as well, who was happy to oblige. The gift turned out to be a two-sided coin though. Magic brought power and prosperity to the inhabitants of Tyria, but it also ignited the fire of greed and jealousy. And so, brutal wars broke out. Now armed with the power of the Bloodstone, these wars sunk whole strips of land. Faced with the immense destruction, it was once again King Doric who traveled to Ara around the year 1 before the Exodus to speak in front of the gods once more. He pleaded with the gods to put an end to the bloodshed. Seeing the harm their gift had done, Dwayna argued that they should revoke the power they set free, and most of the Six agreed. All but Abaddon, who viewed the gift of magic as his crowning achievement as the god of knowledge. Overruling Abaddon's protests, the gods seared the magic back into the Bloodstone and shattered it into 5 pieces and hid them away in a volcano on the Ring of Fire, so that no individual could hold this kind of power alone. But this kind of magical exertion also demanded a sacrifice. Knowing there was no other option, King Doric offered himself, so the now shattered Bloodstones could be sealed with his blood. After the Bloodstones were hidden, the gods tasked Doric's heirs and family to guard and protect them. Angered by the decision, Abaddon's followers, called the Morganites, took up arms and traveled to the Temple of the Six Gods, somewhere on the northern shores of Elona. There, they slaughtered the priests of the other 5 gods, defacing their statues and desecrating their altars and scriptures. Appalled by these actions, the Forgotten rallied their navy and went to war against the Morganites. The Forgotten naval forces being one of the most formidable armies the world had ever seen, it wasn't a fair battle. The Morganite forces were shattered in what would be called the greatest naval battle in human history. The remaining Morganites under the command of Lord Jadoth were pursued by the Forgotten along the Crystal Sea. In his desperation, Jadoth prayed to his god to help his followers defeat the enemy. An eerie silence engulfed the sea, halting any movement. And finally, the god of water answered, striking down the Forgotten ships in a single magical blast and transforming the Morganites into resilient demonic entities. With his new force of demons, Abaddon declared war on the other 5 gods and marched towards Ra. The 5 fought back. With Abaddon's army being unshackled from mortality and regard for mortal life, the war went in his favor at first. But eventually, he was pushed back by the combined power of the 5. Cornered back in Elona's Crystal Sea, where the war took its beginning, he made his last stand. The 5 prevailed and sealed their former comrade and his Morganites into the realm of torment, deep within the mists, As Dhuum before him, Abaddon's power could not be destroyed, so he was imprisoned by chains forged by Balthazar himself. With his consciousness intact and not entirely stripped of his power though, the fallen god of knowledge pledged to take Tyria for himself when the time was right. The victory of the 5 remaining gods came at a high price though. Next to the loss of mortal life, their final battle turned the lush crystal sea into a bleak desert known as the Desolation. The gods destroyed every trace they could find of Abaddon's existence, sinking his once proud Orient cathedral in the Sea of Sorrows, and sealing all remaining scriptures, as a god is only as powerful as his followers. Seeing the harm they had done in the world, the gods decided it was best for mortal life if they departed entirely from the physical side of Tyria. Each of the gods already having a realm of their own in the mists, still connected to Tyria. They left in an event known as the Exodus of the Gods. Without direct guidance of the gods, human life fell into disarray at first, the united human realms growing distrustful of each other and eventually splitting apart, or being the first nation declaring their independence of Ascalon in the year 2 after the Exodus. Kryta, frustrated with the Ascalonians' renewed war efforts against the Char, followed in their tracks at a later date. But after a tumultuous time, there comes times of relative peace. Glint, who had receded into a lair in the newly formed Crystal Desert with her forgotten followers, older and wiser than most civilizations, developed a talent for prophecy. Not only did she foresee the return of the Elder Dragons and began preparing her legacy, she also had visions about humanity around 272 after the Exodus. These visions were compiled into the Flameseeker Prophecies by the Forgotten. For a while, human life on Tyria was mostly uneventful, one notable exception being the brief colonization of Kryta by Ilona's Primeval Dynasty from the years 300 to 358 after the Exodus. Trade and diplomacy between the human kingdoms was allowed to blossom, the scope of which soon eclipsed the nations themselves, leading to guilds being established to organize and secure trade routes. Over the years, these guilds grew more and more influential, their reach unbound by borders. And then, disaster struck once more. The volcano where the gods had hid the Bloodstones centuries before erupted, scattering them on the Tyrian continent. The discovery of the Bloodstones and their magical potential ignited the flame of greed in humanity once more, and the First Guild War broke out. Countless guilds tried to exert their influence over the kingdoms and vied for control to claim the Bloodstones' power for themselves. Ultimately, none of them prevailed, and the kingdoms managed to reclaim some sort of control and peace again. Centuries of war and peace followed, with 2 main wars embroiling the human nations over the time. In one such time of peace, Ascalon began erecting the Great Northern Wall to protect themselves from the ever-present threat of a Char invasion. It was completed in the year 898 after the Exodus, and spanned from the Shiva Peaks to the eastern edge of the Blaze Ridge Mountains. The Second Guild War came and went, leaving the kingdoms in a state of chaos once more, in the year 1000 after the Exodus. Ascalon's guilds emerging as the victor, but still unable to claim the Bloodstones for themselves. The following time of peace was short-lived though, and the Third Guild War erupted in the year 1013 after the Exodus, this war being the first one to incorporate the nations themselves, instead of being independent guilds fighting for control. The war was brutal and relentless between Kryta and Ascalon in particular, tensions still being high from the Second Guild War. After countless years of fighting and the kingdoms being significantly weakened by the war efforts, another force in the world realized their chance to strike. The Char, now united under the banner of the Flame Legion, saw their opportunity and struck the human kingdoms with such force that humanity had no other option than to declare the war with each other over and return home to defend their lands around the year 1050 after the Exodus. Ascalon managed to hold the Char off for a while thanks to the Great Northern Wall, but not without significant losses of land behind the walls, among other great cities losing their capital Draskir to the Char. But with the wall in their way, the Char stood at an impasse. Rallying their troops to patience though, the Flame Legion shamans still had an ace up their sleeves. In another part of the world, around the year 1067 after the Exodus, the Krytan drunkard Saul D'Alessio lost a bet he couldn't repay. Fearing for his life, he turned to stealing from travelers to repay his debt. Saul was caught and trialed as a thief, his punishment being exile from Kryta. With the sentence executed, he wandered through a forest, alone, broken, and lost, surviving from tree roots and berries alone. In his delirious state, he came across a hidden city of the Mursat. With no other option in his ragged and famished state, he wandered inside the city and begged its citizens for aid. The Mursat, feeling that their time had come, obliged and helped Saul. In return, he regarded them as gods and vowed to spread their faith. On his return to Kryta, Saul founded the White Mantle and spread his new religion of the Unseen Ones far and wide. In the year 1071 after the Exodus, the Flame Legion shamans had finished preparing their ultimate weapon and unleashed it on Ascalon. They used the Cauldron of Cataclysm to call down giant burning crystals from the sky and scorch the land, shattering the Great Northern Wall and destroying most of Ascalon's remaining strongholds in the process. With this, the way for their forces was free, and so they stormed into the lands, destroying everything and everyone that dared to stand before them. With most of Ascalon back under their control, they marched further upon Kryta and Or. Or, being a mostly peaceful religious nation of scholars and researchers, without a great military, and additionally being weakened by the Third Guild War as well, they had little means of protecting themselves from the Char. Realizing this, and fearing another Searing, King Riza's advisor, Vizier Kilbron, entered the restricted vaults of Ra, where the most powerful scriptures and magical items the gods left behind were stored. There, he found the lost scrolls detailing a powerful spell which Kilbron believed could save his nation. Alone in his tower, protected by a squad of soldiers who fended off the invaders, he managed to cast the spell. But the magic he unleashed was more than he had bargained for, the spell making no difference between friend or foe, and obliterating the whole peninsula, causing the great nation of Or to sink beneath the waves. Around the same time, the Char marched onto Kryta. The severely weakened Lion Guard was no match for the organized warbands of the Char. King Jardan, fearing for his life, fled the country and left the kingdom leaderless and more vulnerable than ever. Seeing this, Saul d'Alessio and his White Mantle followers took up the challenge to defend their lands. Saul assumed the position of a general and led his forces into war against the Char. Firstly, he was successful in his struggle, but slowly he began to lose as well. Desperate, he devised a plan to end the war once and for all. He gathered a small troop of his most elite fighters to sneak into the Char main encampment to assassinate the Char leaders, leaving the war bands disorganized. This didn't work though, and he and his men were soon discovered by the soldiers guarding the camp. Fights broke out, and cornered and hopeless, Saul did the only thing he had left: prayed to his gods. Surprisingly, the Unseen Ones answered, and 3 Morsad appeared out of thin air, decimating the Char with their powerful spectral agony. Initially, Saul was elated of their victory. But then, the Morsad turned onto his men, wishing only to be seen by their most devout followers. Only a handful of the squad remained. Witnessing this betrayal, Saul realized what he had done in spreading his religion over Kryta. Noticing the change in Saul's demeanor, the Morsad decided to not let him return to Lion's Arch. They seized him, taking him away to an unknown location. The remaining White Mantle zealots returned to Kryta as victors and assumed the power of the throne for themselves, governing Kryta in the king's stead and turning Saul into a martyr who had sacrificed himself for Kryta's sake. A year later, Prince Rurik stood atop the shattered wall in the last remaining Ascalonian stronghold of Ascalon City. He saw no other option than to take the remaining population and flee the lands, searching for a new life in Kryta. Without the Great Wall and Char already having built encampments all over Ascalon, there was no chance to retake the land. His father, King Adalbern, disagreed. As an heir of King Doric, he couldn't relinquish these lands and wanted to fight to the bitter end, sacrificing his subjects if need be. Rurik, who had lost the love of his life in the aftermath of the Searing, and having fought the Char in the years since, witnessing the suffering of his people firsthand, couldn't accept that. He went against his father's wishes, gathering every subject that was willing, and with the help of his most trusted soldier, he made his way to the Shiver Peaks. Unknowing to him, setting the wheels in motion that would lead to the fulfillment of the Flameseeker prophecies.